Okay, everyone, we will go ahead and get this started. Good morning to everyone who's here so far. We will have our other friends who are joining us roll in as we go. Thank you again for coming to another installment of our webinar series. For those who aren't familiar, I represent the Delaware Living Shorelines Committee here in Delaware, if you're not in Delaware. My name is Olivia Allred, and this is part of our outreach and education goals for that committee. So basically, we do webinar series a couple times a year to get people acquainted and introduced to different living shoreline projects all across the country. We're really trying to expand our reach, but we'll get into a little bit more of that briefly. Today, we have someone coming from Louisiana, which is very cool and exciting. I'll let her introduce herself momentarily, but today's topic is the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana. So I'm just your host for today. I work within DNREC in the state of Delaware in the Wetlands Program. But we have an exciting topic we've been looking forward to, and a few reminders before we get going. Please mute yourself and turn off your camera during the presentation, just to save bandwidth and to make sure we can all hear the presenter. This webinar is being recorded, so if you have to leave early, no problem. If you want to share it with others afterwards, it will be on our Delaware Living Shorelines Committee webpage for your viewing pleasure. And then we're going to try and take questions and comments at the end of our webinar. So feel free at that point to turn on your camera and unmute yourself and share anything, questions, comments, concerns, whatever it is, or put them in the chat box and I will gladly read through them at the end. With that being said, we will go ahead and get rolling for the day. So go ahead and take it away. And we'll go from there. Go ahead and share your screen.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen here. So my name is Dara Bach, and I manage the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana's oyster shell recycling program. This is just one of the restoration-based programs that the organization hosts, along with other program areas that I'll go through today. But I will mostly focus, of course, on our Living Shoreline program. So let's see if I can get the next slide up. Okay, so Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana was established in 1988, so we're celebrating our 35th anniversary this year as a coalition of concerned citizens who wanted to band together to address Louisiana's coastal land loss crisis and economic or environmental problems. And so since then, we have been organizing around policy advocacy, education, and then finally restoration. So a little background on Louisiana's coastal land loss. I want to go back to the very beginning, how Louisiana was formed and why it's so susceptible to the highest rate of land loss in the world. So Louisiana is the drainage area for the Mississippi River. So that drains 41% of the US, covering 31 states and 2 Canadian provinces. That is a lot of water and sediment coming down from the rest of North America through Louisiana. And so when the river brings water and sediment down through this area, it formed the land that I'm sitting on today by depositing sediment. So we can see here that only 10,000 years ago, New Orleans did not exist. And that's important because if you're up in the Northeast, you're on, your land was probably once ocean. So it's been land and hard formed sediment and rock for, as much as millions of years, of course. But the land I'm on today is really new, which means that it's not as settled, it's not as firm, and therefore it's more susceptible to erosion and subsidence. So we see here that between 2000 and years ago and today, the deltaic lobe that I'm sitting on today was formed as the river snaked back and forth in its banks, delivering sediment in different areas over time. And that's how the river functioned, of course, before we built the levee system. So in 1927, there was the Great Flood, which killed a lot of people, destroyed a lot of property, and got the federal government interested in preventing that from happening on a yearly basis. The river would flood annually and, disrupt lives along the river, which was quickly becoming a super important economic zone and a super important place for people to live always. So the federal government started constructing the federal levee system with the Army Corps of Engineers, and that turned off that sediment deposit machine that would continually build up the soils that I'm sitting on today. That's a big part of the problem. Of course, we have other elements that are contributing to this land loss: sea level rise, upriver dams, invasive species, subsidence. So if you've ever been to New Orleans and you've seen the potholes, one reason that that's happening is that the land under us is sinking and it's causing the concrete to crack. Another big reason is oil and gas infrastructure. So you can see in this image in the bottom left corner that any straight line cut through the wetlands that protect New Orleans is man-made for either oil and gas extraction or transportation. And by cutting up the wetlands like that, we've introduced saltwater, freshwater, and all other things to break up the land further. Navigation channels, oil spills have eaten away at our critical natural defenses from hurricanes, and then of course hurricanes that destroy land as they come up through the Gulf. So the result, we've lost over 2,000 square miles of land over the last 100 years. That's the same size as the entire state of Delaware. So that's why we exist, to do something about it. So main function of CRCL was always to advocate for and work with the state to implement large-scale holistic restoration projects. So we contribute to the development of Louisiana's coastal master plan every 7 years, and those are major large-scale projects. So we encourage people to participate in that public input process to get involved. But we also want to show people that restoration can be done on the ground by people and not just, waiting for the state or the federal government to take action. And that's why we started our restoration programs in 2000 to get people outside, planting trees, to get them engaged with restoration, to encourage them to vote with coastal restoration in mind, to vote with the environment in mind, and to give them a way to get involved. So in 2000, we started planting native trees, grasses, and marsh grasses across the state. So here's one of our recent restoration projects on a beach in Southwest Louisiana. So the Native Plants Program gives people the opportunity to engage. We work with different landowners. We do different types of projects. So since 2000, we've engaged 15,000 volunteers, planted over 3.5 million plants, and improved 500 acres of coastal forests, brackish marsh, and then beach dune habitats. And as you can see here, this program has done a really great job, even though we're located in New Orleans, which is over by that. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but anyway, if you know where New Orleans is, we've really gotten, out into the state, which is great. So a little bit about project design, because I know that's really essential here. So I think we're just now starting to really see our marsh grass plantings, which are planted along shorelines as living shorelines. But I think more traditionally, living shorelines have come from the oyster shell recycling program that I'm going to talk more about in just a minute, because that's really constructing like almost a breakwater or a jetty along a shoreline. But I think that now we're starting to see that we can consider the planting of marsh grasses or trees along a shoreline can also be considered a living shoreline, because they hold soils in, they expand horizontally and vertically. So that's why I wanted to touch on the Native Plants Program today as well. So obviously we identify a community need, an environmental need. So for example, recently we did a tree planting on Avery Island, which is a really important economic, cultural, and environmental site in Louisiana, and they had an oil spill on the site because there was some extraction happening on the site. And so we planted trees in the remediation area. So that was kind of an example of a community and environmental need that we want to address. We partnered with Avery Island. we obviously apply for funding, but either before or after a need or a project comes, onto our radar. We select the site. So here you can see Gardner, who runs our native plants program. He has a soil tester in his hand to test the soil to make sure that it's a good salinity level for the trees. We either buy plants or grow them out at our nursery. We sign landowner agreements, so you don't actually need a permit in Louisiana to plant a tree, but you do need the permission of whoever owns the land. So that's really what the permission process looks like for this program. Plan and host volunteer days, and that's going to involve volunteer recruitment. We have another staff member who recruits volunteers, works with school groups, corporate groups, public volunteers to organize them, and we host the days. We give out lunch and t-shirts to thank our volunteers. We do an intro talk to educate them on the site, and then they get to work. And then we monitor our planting sites, and that would be measuring the height or the diameter of the plants that we've planted, or we will throw a quadrat and measure how many plants are in the quadrat. So here's an example of a really successful restoration project. You can see this fence being built by volunteers, and then they planted tens of thousands of dune grasses, and by the next year or years following, you can see that the dune grasses really took shape. So like I said, we do annual monitoring, and we've found a really great success rate with over 80% trees being alive. Years after the project, acres of marsh are being restored, beyond the planting site. So that's all really successful. Just another program that we run is that students and general public can collect cypress seeds off of trees around their area and share them with us, and we will grow them out at our native plants nursery. So that brings me to the oyster shell recycling program, which is really my bread and butter. I run the program. I've run it for 3 years. It's a wonderful program, engages people from fishers all the way through restaurant goers and then back around to the tribes that we work with to implement our living shoreline projects. So here you can see volunteers working with the recycled oyster shells, and I'll tell you more about that as we go. Oyster reefs are highly valuable but at-risk ecosystems in Louisiana that support our fishing industry, our seafood supply, wildlife habitat. They filter water, they sequester carbon, and they protect shorelines. So oysters are often called ecosystem engineers because while they protect marsh areas from eroding into the water, they also provide habitat for oyster growth. They provide habitat for crabs, fish, migratory birds, because Louisiana is one of the most important flyways in the world. Louisiana also produces a huge amount of oysters. So oysters are a cultural staple here. They're not a delicacy, they're a historic feature of the local diet. The tribes that we work with have been eating oysters, for millennia. I think it's unlike in a lot of areas where oysters are considered a delicacy. Here, they're really part of the diet. So it's really important that we maintain our oyster population for cultural reasons as well as economic, and then, of course, ecosystem reasons as well. If you didn't know, Louisiana exports a third of the nation's oysters, so that's really important resource for seafood farmers. And there's a really high percentage of jobs in Louisiana that rely on seafood. But up to 80% of Gulf oyster reefs have been lost in the past 200 years. So part of that is due to the same reasons that I talked about why Louisiana is experiencing land loss, those environmental changes, man-made changes. And then we also have what's called the shell deficit. So obviously more shell is being removed from the water than can naturally regenerate. And that's why we return oyster shells to the water through this program. Why we return oyster shells to the water is because they grow other oysters on top of them. So when oyster larvae or baby oysters get released into the water column by adult oysters, they float freely through the water looking for something to land on. When we put the recycled shell out there, it provides an attractive habitat for the oysters to latch onto and grow. And here you can see an example of the protection that this shoreline project that we built in Plaquemines was really successful. You can see that sediment was building up in between the shoreline and the marsh toe, and that the reef was also growing up and out over time as oysters settled on the top of the recycled shells. And this site that you're seeing here, I'll talk a little bit more later, but it's a sacred mound site for one of our local tribes. Another part of the program that I've listed here is just the importance of keeping this resource out of landfills, protecting significant sites, restoring ecosystems, and then this really beautiful synergy that we're introducing between fishers, restaurants, restaurant goers, reintroducing that connection of what's on your plate and where it came from. So our recycling service, we offer 3 or 5 day a week pickup for restaurants in New Orleans. We offer marketing and promotional opportunities for restaurants, really trying to promote this idea that sustainable seafood is important and that patrons should be making smart choices with the seafood that they consume and the food they consume in general. We provide the opportunity for restaurants, of course, to participate in sustaining healthy oyster reefs so that they can be sure that there will be oysters on their menu in the future. We also do special event pickup service for free, so like for Jazz Fest, things like that. And we had a huge victory this year in New Orleans. We advocated for a tax credit to get passed. I went up to Baton Rouge, presented in the legislature, and it passed unanimously. So next year, restaurants who recycle oyster shells will be eligible to receive $1 for every 50 pounds recycled, up to $2,000 annually. So it's a great incentive for restaurants to participate in our program, but also to encourage restaurants across Louisiana to get creative in looking for ways to recycle their shells. And that might look like giving the shells back to the seafood distributor from whom they buy their oysters. And that if they can provide documentation of that relationship, they can get this credit. And it's really important for us to encourage this behavior, even if restaurants can't participate in our program. It's really important that these shells make it back to the water. So this is just a little overview of how it works from restaurant to pickup. Volunteers sort the shells, take out any trash. The shells cure naturally by the sun and the elements at our curing site. Volunteers put them into bags. And then we host reef build events where the volunteers load the shells onto boats and construct the living shoreline by hand. And then we do annual monitoring. And here you can see a recycled shell and a baby oyster growing inside of it. So that's really our work coming to fruition there. So just a little map of some of our restaurants, and then we have some signage outside of our restaurants to get people thinking about making their choice to eat there because they recycle oyster shells. We also take public drop-off for the public to recycle their shells as well. So getting a little bit more into our restoration, we've engaged over 3,000 volunteers, bagging shells and building reefs. We've recycled over 13 million pounds of shell and constructed 5 oyster reefs since we started doing this program in 2014. Here's our 5 reef locations. They're all located more in the southeast of Louisiana's coast because that's really where oysters are super prominent in the ecosystem. We have worked with 2 different indigenous tribes that I'll talk about later, and we plan to work with more in the future. So about our project design, just like the Native Plants program, it really starts with partnerships. It starts with people approaching us, telling us that they have a need, they have an eroding cultural site, they have a super important fishing area that's been impacted by reef loss or something like that. Then we're going to do site selection. So here you see a tribal elder of the Pointe-au-Chien Indian tribe, Mr. Donald, and one of our staff members. He had contacted us that there was an eroding site. So we went out, looked at the site, did salinity testing, and determined that it would be a good candidate for a living shoreline. Either before or after that, we have to secure funding. So we are busy always applying for grants, whether they're federal, state, private, philanthropic grants, corporate donations, public donations. we work off of a super diverse range of funding sources. And so sometimes it's chicken and the egg, sometimes the project comes from a funding source, sometimes we apply for a funding source around a predetermined project that we want to make happen. So in this case, that you see here, Mr. Donald had a mound site that was sacred to the tribe that he was watching erode, every day. So we had, in this case, the project idea before the funding. And we recently were awarded an EPA grant to construct the project to protect that site. So then for this program, because we're depositing material on water bottom, we are required to have a state permit. So we need to contract out an engineering survey. So we contract with a local engineering firm. They take bathymetric and topographic survey data to see the landscape of the project site, so we can determine what that project is going to look like during construction. So this is an example of some site analysis that we did before applying for funding to show how the erosion had happened over time. And I'm actually going to go into this towards the end of the presentation further, but that's a bit about how we receive funding. And then this is an example of the surveys that we received through our partner. We have the living shoreline, sketched out using these plats, and then we apply for permits with the state Department of Natural Resources, the Army Corps, and then any landowner who is involved in the project will either sign a landowner agreement or issue us a permit if they're that advanced with their land management. And this contractor that we contract with to do the surveys will actually design the revetment style living shoreline for us, using the bathymetric and topographic surveys to inform how much shell should go in each area along the shoreline. And we'll do a calculation based on that of how we need to construct the project with volunteers. Then we collect and bag our shell, plan and host volunteer build days, and then we monitor all of our living shoreline projects for 1 year or for 5 years following construction. So from our monitoring, we'll take a sample of the substrate growing atop the recycled shell on the reef site to see what organisms are present in the sample, and that might be baby oysters, crabs, mussels, fish, all that good stuff. And we've seen that our average density of live oysters per square meter is 32.43, and that's over the minimum target threshold recommended by NOAA for a successful oyster reef restoration project. We've also done some pretty in-depth aerial monitoring of shoreline erosion to find that these projects can reduce the rate of marsh erosion of surrounding wetlands by up to 50% annually compared to control sites. And that monitoring that I just mentioned with the shoreline erosion was done on this reef. It was our first reef we ever constructed, and we used steel gabion baskets to hold the bagged shell. This was one of our longest projects, half-mile long, 800 tons of recycled shell. And this is where we've done significant shoreline analysis to see, here you can see the improvement in annual shoreline retreat over time. There's always going to be a natural background rate due to all the factors that are causing erosion, but we can absolutely see that we're inspiring a reduction in that annual rate. So this is an example of the data that we produce from our biological monitoring sampling. So we're basically filling a 5-gallon bucket with substrate from the reef project and counting all live and dead organisms in that bucket. So we can see here that in year 3, we had 2 generations of oysters growing, and you can see that because there's 2 really major spikes in the graph on the left. And then in year 4, and this could depend on the growth, like the linear development of the project itself, or just the time that we sampled during oyster spawning season. So it's interesting to look at the way that the reefs distribute themselves as oysters grow on top of their recycled shells. Our second project was the first project that we worked with the Pointe-au-Chien Indian tribe on. We just completed our second project with them with plans for a third. So in 2019, we used 200 tons of bagged shell to create a 400-foot fringing reef structure. And this was not created with gabion baskets, the steel baskets that you saw in the previous reef. This was just using the loose bags. And that was because we wanted to really engage people in every step of the process. For us, these projects are pretty small scale with the intention of getting people outside, getting them engaged, working with tribes directly so that people continue to engage with coastal land loss. So because of that, we wanted to make sure that volunteers had an opportunity to build the reef as well as contribute to the bagging of shell and all the other ways that we engage volunteers. And so the shell was built up directly on the banks of this mound site. So here you can see some images of what we see when we monitor this reef. We see over 21% oysters in the community assemblage, which is consistent with the successful target range for the percentage of oysters that makes up the community on the reef. We have seen a pretty significant decline in live oysters in recent years of monitoring this reef, and that's probably just due to environmental factors like salinity change or hurricanes. So this is our third reef, which was also built with the gabion basket using loose or bagged shell. And we've seen linear trajectory in oyster growth at this reef, probably just a more salty site because it's further out into the Gulf. And that means that the reef is really, developing over time. So here we can see from year 1 to year 2, a higher density of live oysters, which means that the reef is developing over time in a really positive community assemblage of oysters to other community species. Our fourth reef project was built with another tribe, the Atakapa Ishakchawasha tribe of Grand Bayou Indian Village, and this reef site protects their lemon tree mound site. And what I love to share about this project is that we built the reef in 2021 and 2022 with the oyster shells, and we're actually returning this year to put mangrove propagules out along this site to introduce native plant shoreline protection as well. So here we have before the reef was built and then after the reef was built. So that's pretty cool. So this blue line shows the shoreline at this project site before Hurricane Ida. And then you can see at the bottom how little the shoreline changed where the reef was built, and this was actually before we finished this project. So today the reef covers the whole shoreline on the right side of this photo. And of course, we wish that we had had time to construct the whole project before Hurricane Ida came, because we can see already the amount of protection that the reef is providing for that lower right-hand quadrant of the photo. So now there's reef protection along this whole shoreline. So I just wanted to show a couple photos of the mangrove project. So here you see volunteers collecting seeds from naturally occurring mangrove plants in this area. Then they potted them up into these little pots. You can see the little seeds poking out. We drove them up to our nursery, and then we grew them out into mature adult plants, and then we will return to the reef site in just a couple weeks to plant those propagules along the reef site. So that's a really exciting way that we're expanding the impact of that living shoreline with native plants as well as oyster shells. And we hope to continue to take reintervention like that in the future. So that brings us to our last reef project. We just completed it about 2 weeks ago. This was a really fun project that I got to lead on. And here you can see volunteers putting out the shell. And I'm going to go into a little bit more about the reason that that project was built that Mr. Donald showed us, like I showed him showing us the problem in that previous photo. So what we had here was a small cut dug in front of this mound site. You can see the mound with the arrow in the middle. The trees are built up over this indigenous ancestral ground site. And it had got a cut dug in front of it as a property line, not even a navigation channel, just a property line. And what has happened in this zone down here is that the property lines were cut 3 feet, and now they've all widened to 10 feet and up, which is really unfortunate. So essentially this canal was opening in front of the mound and eating away at the mound. And so here you can see the property line that was cut, and it wasn't even cut. There wasn't actually any access between the property line and this large bayou. But over time, water pressure just broke down and introduced a cut in between the bayou and that property line. And now it basically looks like it was man-made for you to get a boat down there, but really it was never meant to be a navigational channel. And you can see what I think is really beautiful about this is you can see the impact of the tribe having built up these mound sites over time. There's trees living on those sites because they were built up with sediment and man-made structure over time, and that means that they're higher ground and they're supporting tree life still. So I think that's beautiful. So this is the target area for that project. And we're actually going to return this coming fall to close off that opening, but we did not receive permits yet to close it off. So the living shoreline just lined the banks of that project. So you can see here, I'm going to try to play a video of the project after completion about 2 weeks ago. And here you can see some volunteers hard at work and the project lining the shoreline of that opening. And then, like I said, next year we will return to fill this area in with hay bales. So this is how to participate. Obviously, most of y'all are not local, but this is what we usually tell people that are in the local area. We encourage them to eat at a restaurant that recycles with us, to recycle their shells if they buy shells at home, to volunteer, to donate, to engage with us on social media, and then to sign up for our action alerts and newsletters, because we always encourage people to take political action after volunteering with us. And that is all, and I'd love to take any questions.
We'll open the floor up to any questions. Feel free to put them in the chat box and I will read them aloud if you're a little camera shy.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
So I noticed y'all do a lot of projects with native tribes. How do y'all select who y'all will work with?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think the answer is really that it's an organic partnership process. We also have an outreach department that does tabling all over the state all year round. So they're out meeting people at schools, at events, at festivals. And I think our organization has just done a beautiful job of being present in communities across the coast. So I think both of those partnerships that you saw with the 2 different tribes really just came about naturally through communication and just trust building. The Pointe-au-Chien Indian tribe specifically did approach CRCL back in 2018, saying that they heard about the program and wondered if we could do a project to protect that first mound site. So I would say that that really just came from a request from the community, and we were able to fulfill the request by applying for grants. And then we just built this beautiful ongoing partnership with the tribe that encouraged us to return back to that community to build a second project. And the other tribe that we've worked with, I think it was a similar situation, and we are now planning to do another reef with another tribe, and that tribe happens to be in this sister tribe trio with those other tribes. So I think for that reason, it's sort of a snowball effect of partnering with one and then another that they're connected with.
Gotcha.
Great. I saw two questions come in the chat box that are related to each other. So the first one is from Joe. How are you hoping hay bales will close the opening encroaching on the mound? And then the other one's from Mark, similar question. Why are you using hay bales to close the opening versus other materials?
Right. So I would like to use oyster shell for that, but it's become such a deep hole. It's a scour hole at this point in front of the mound that it would really be a waste of bagged shell to drop it into that hole, because it would not, the majority of the shell would be encased inside a giant pile of shell, and that means that it wouldn't provide habitat for oyster growth on the outside. And so we've been looking for a different natural material to fill that scour hole, and hay bales have been used before to fill scour holes like that, because we just would rather use a natural material instead of like concrete. So as far as I know, it's just sort of becoming an industry standard for filling holes like that in the coastal Louisiana.
Another question, are you using reef balls or other materials that may not be considered natural?
We are not. We did use the Gabion steel baskets for 2 of our projects, and those were successful, but since we've really gone in the direction of using volunteer power to build the projects from start to finish, it doesn't really make sense for us anymore to use larger scale materials like the baskets or reef balls that have to be inserted using like a crane or something. And I think we've also just seen a really high success rate with the effectiveness of the loose bag projects. And at this point, we are not really looking to make the projects more complicated.
Another one, large round bales or smaller rectangular bales?
That's a great question. We've actually never done a project like this before. We are currently in talks with the oil and gas company who owns the property. We need to get their permission before we move forward with the project. Once we get their permission, we're going to release an RFP for an engineering contractor with whom we would hope that they would have a background in coastal restoration, and we will make the final determination of materials and construction at that point.
Plastic bag concerns or future solutions?
Another good question. Yeah, the bags that you saw in most of those photos are a nylon aquaculture grade mesh that's been traditionally the industry standard for this type of project. We did test out a different product made of coconut fiber this year, but unfortunately the product that we purchased, the bags broke after we had the bagging event, and then we tried to move the bags and they all broke open. So that was really unfortunate. I think the product was just not strong enough to hold those heavy shells. So we're still absolutely looking for alternatives. We are talking with other oyster shell recycling programs about alternatives, and we've even applied for grants to do research. We haven't been awarded anything yet, but it's a major concern for us, and we're working on it. If anyone has recommendations or have tried something that works, I'm all ears. My email is here. I'd love to talk about it. I'd love to look for an alternative other than the one that we tried that didn't work out for us.
Another one, the bags of shells are above the water line. Are these areas impacted by the tides? I'm assuming oyster shells above the water line are not viable for spat. And are mangroves invasive?
Oh, okay. So that's so 2 questions. So for the first question, we do have a tidal range here, of course, just like anywhere else, but there's sort of an interplay for us between protecting the shoreline and providing oyster habitat. So I think for us, we want to make sure that the project is high enough that when the tide comes in and there's high wave energy, it's still protecting the uppermost soil layer of the marsh. And so for that reason, I think we sort of discount the oyster ecosystem at the top of the reef in the interest of protecting the marsh from erosion, knowing that any oyster, any recycled shell that's under the water full time will provide habitat. So it's sort of an interplay between those two factors. And then as far as the mangroves, I think that it's sort of how you think about it. Yes, they are creeping further and further north as the salinity gradient changes in coastal Louisiana, but they are nevertheless a native species to at least the like southernmost parts of our wetlands. They've never been found as far north as they are today, but that is occurring naturally, and we are planning to use them to our advantage because they are a great resource as far as growing quickly and holding soils in place. So I think as we see more saltwater intrusion in these areas, we really have no other choice but to use mangroves to our advantage to hold those soils in place.
Okay, more coming in. How does your inventory of shells sync up with your project queue? For example, is there enough supply as you take on work?
Yes, absolutely there is. It's unbelievable how much volume the restaurants in New Orleans produce. I think because oysters are not a delicacy here, they're on the menu at hundreds of restaurants every single day. We get so much shell. I mean, really, we're getting more volume of shell with fewer restaurant partners than most other oyster shell recycling programs. So that's to our benefit. But I think what really actually limits us as far as the syncing up is the efficiency of the bagging process. It takes a whole lot of manpower and a lot of hours and hard work and sweat to get the oyster shells bagged up. So that's really what limits us from executing more projects. So we actually have more shell than we can bag quickly enough.
Well, I have a question based on bagging because we just bagged over 2,000 shells. What is your way of doing it? Do you guys use like machinery and then table, fill them in by hand, get the bags out?
We have no machinery. In fact, our shell yard has no power or water hookup right now. We're working on that as we're sort of building it out as an educational space. So we're working on that. But right now, we don't have power. So we don't have any equipment for the bagging. We use PVC pipes to hold the bags. And then this year, we did have one of our super dedicated volunteers buy materials from Home Depot himself. He came into our office and we designed a table. So we're now using that, but we've been operating since 2014 with just the PVC pipes. But now we have this table that's been working really great, and it has holes on the top of it. We use buckets to dump the shell on top of the table, and then there's people raking the shell into the holes, and under the holes PVC pipe with the bag. So that's been working great.
Thanks. Okay, another annual budget of your organization and number of employees.
Sure, our annual budget is a little over 2 million, and we have, I think right now I would say we have about 17 full-time staff, and we have 5 AmeriCorps members. We bring on 4 or 5 AmeriCorps members every year for an 11-month service term. So that sort of adds to our staff capacity. And we're hiring 2 positions right now, so we are growing.
Great. Amanda has a comment. They have used rectangular hay bales at Assateague National Park to fill mosquito ditches not far from Delaware here. And it was actually an accident first. When waterlogged, the bales accumulate sediment, and if they are stabilized in place, they can be effective at filling ditches. And she loves the use of natural materials.
Oh, that's great. Can she email me about that? I would love to talk about that.
Yes.
Thank you.
She has homework.
Okay, great.
Other questions from folks in the audience at all? Okay, great. Well, you guys have my email as well as Dara's email, so feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for presenting and sharing all this information useful for our committee, and I'm sure lots of other people in the Mid-Atlantic, but I do see other questions popping in. I'll read it. I'll go ahead. I usually don't, but I will. The
Okay.
aerial photo of the shell reef installed by volunteers to protect the shoreline at the time of item makes a good case for efficacy. The planning program. Do you have examples of how planted marsh mangroves have done in similar protection?
I don't. It's the first time we're trying this as, like I said, a dual intervention, but I know just, from experience that mangroves provide really good shoreline protection. But yeah, I don't know. I can't say what research has been done on that, but you're welcome to reach out if you have questions or you're interested to our native plants program coordinator, Gardner, and his emails on our website.
Great. Okay, everyone. Thank you guys for being here today. This webinar will be up on our webpage soon, and we'll see you guys sometime in the winter.
Thank
Thanks
you
again.
all.